Amazon's got some nice boxes. You know, I'm not a fan of Amazon, like, as a company and what they do, but gotta admit, they got some nice boxes. I grew up in the suburbs, and honestly, it's great. The lawns are big, the schools are awesome. We pump out CO2 at crazy high rates and are destroying our earth. There's parks, plenty of places for your kids to have fun. The suburbs are major contributors to our racist tendencies. Everyone's friendly, and we all get our own place to live in. Everything's the same. We're all the same. Hatred runs in our blood. The suburbs are destroying America. And that's really not an exaggeration. Who wants to have to drive 20 minutes to get to the nearest store? Or have the nearest cool place to hang out be a dying mall? Or the Walmart parking lot? America's bounty of suburban sprawl is a major source of many of our issues. Climate change, poverty, racism. They're all tied back to suburban sprawl. Suburbia in itself is a contradiction. It seems like everything that the suburbs are supposed to be advertised as is just the complete opposite. It's seen as a haven to improve American lives, but as the past 50 years have shown, that's a lie. Take the environment for example, something that the suburbs is killing. Pavement absorbs heat. All of this pavement from parking lots and intersections causes heat islands to form. Because suburban neighborhoods are so spread apart, it means more infrastructure has to be built to accommodate that. Stuff like water pipes, electrical poles, and roads. University of Utah's Arthur Nelson found that the infrastructure costs to build in the suburbs are 2.5 times more expensive than to build in cities. If we lived in more denser areas, we wouldn't have this problem. And the biggest environmental threat? The sprawl requires you to own a car. To get anywhere in the suburbs, pretty much a car is a prerequisite. To get to my nearest Target, it takes about 10 minutes. To get to the big city, Minneapolis, Minnesota, it takes about an hour. Think about if I lived in a denser area. Not even a big bustling city, but just a place where everything's more tightly packed, with everything I need just a couple blocks away at most. Think about all the tons of CO2 I'd be saving. Now think about all the millions of people living in the suburbs and multiply that further. It adds up. In fact, 27% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from cars, and the suburbs just perpetuate that. Suburbs are environmentally unfriendly. The suburban world is a disconnected world, where the only way to get around is by car. And that's a death sentence. Everything about it is a contradiction. They told us it was going to give us stability, a chance to grow. They lied.
These privileges takes much more than just legal right. It requires a trained mind and a healthy body. It requires a decent home and the chance to find a job.
January 8, 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson declares war on an enemy that has been plaguing American lives. This time it's not the Soviets. It's poverty. Thus starts a movement to get rid of poverty in our country's cities. In some ways, it worked. In many ways, it failed. 50 years later, on January 11, 2014, Lee Scazzari, a single mother of two, lives in poverty in her Long Island, New York home. Despite having a stable job, a house to live in, and a car to get to work, she and her two children live under the poverty line. And she's not the only one. According to CityLab in 2017, 1 out of 4 suburbanites are considered poor. Between 2000 and 2013, the number of people living under the poverty line in cities grew by 29%. In the suburbs, 66%. It all comes down to America's zoning problem. Zoning, for those of you who don't know, restricts what can and cannot be built in a certain area of a city. Many times people don't want apartments to be built next to their house. It'll bring traffic, make parking harder, it'll block views and bring crime. They just want single-family suburban homes as far as the eye can see. So these restrictive zoning laws actually decrease supply less than demand, which means the prices rise. High housing prices means that people can't afford to live in cities, but cities are where jobs, healthcare, and social services are. But now it's not where the housing is. For many low-income families, they have no choice but to move to the suburbs because they're getting priced out in the city. But just because it's cheaper to live in the suburbs doesn't make it any more affordable. Just look at Skazari. She has to live in the suburban home, but despite that is living under the poverty line. Why? Just look at what you need to do in order to survive in the suburbs. You have to get a car, which costs money to repair, to run, and to insure. Maintaining a house also costs a lot of money. You have to maintain it all by yourself. If something breaks, you either have to hire a repairman or spend money to repair it yourself. If you want to get anywhere, to school, to the hospital, to anywhere you have to go, you have to spend gas money to use a car. And these costs add up and leads to poverty being perpetuated in our suburban areas. Skazari is just one of millions of cases of people being trapped in the suburbs. Trapped in a money hole known as cars and suburban living. The more we build suburbs and only suburbs, the more likely we're gonna have cases like Skazari, where families like hers end up trapped, end up hungry, or worse. Everything about it is a contradiction. I thought it would set us free, but everything just looks the same. We look the same. We all just live in these little boxes, afraid to go outside, doing the same thing every day. It's eerie. Suburbs. They're designed to be similar, friendly, welcoming, but that's not always the vibe you get. It lacks the chaotic naturalness that comes from cities or even the rural areas. It feels more artificial. I can see why someone would want to live in the suburbs. Sometimes it's the best choice, but just because it's the best choice doesn't mean it's a good choice. We're isolated. Literal fences divide us. Engineer Alex Balshov explains that people, at their core, require socialization that the suburbs just take away. Suburban developments usually have a minimum price for houses, like the cheapest model that they offer. Now, because suburbs have a price floor, it means that usually middle class and usually white families are able to afford to live in these said suburbs. Then this makes suburbs of cities more segregated. Zoning laws create single-family suburban homes that only a certain group of people live in. This makes it so you live by people that look like you and that think like you. So many times the suburbs become homogeneous and also isolated, which is a very dangerous concoction. The thing that's killing America the most dangerous aspect of suburbs is our hate. We live in these little boxes, but there's not a lot of things to do outside of it because we live in the suburbs where everything looks the same. When everything's the same, anything that's different seems hostile. You mistrust anyone that looks different or thinks differently. These homogeneous communities cause in-group versus out-group tendencies, and that bleeds into our society. It's easier to legislate policy that hurts other people if they don't look like the people living in your neighborhood. You don't really interact with any Mexicans or black people or any other people of color. So when you see them being targeted by police on the news, or being put in cages on the border, it's a lot easier to not even bat an eye. Our homogeneous neighborhoods, along with the isolation it brings, teaches us to mistrust, to hate even. When our entire worlds are suburbs made of little boxes. Anything outside these boxes seems like they're enemies. It turns it into an us versus them situation. So it's no wonder that murders have risen 16.9% in suburbs, compared to dropping 16% in cities. It's no wonder why suburbs are known as the echo chambers of America, and it should be no wonder to anyone. why white supremacy finds its roots deep in the heart of the suburbs. I get it. Owning a house is cool. Giving your family a safe place to live is great. And having independence is admirable. But we can have this while at the same time addressing the problems that the suburbs bring. Climate change, poverty, racism, they all have roots in our suburb-centric culture. We need to change our zoning laws so we can have apartments and duplexes next to single-family homes. This makes housing more affordable for people to live in, so poverty might not be such a huge issue. Throw in some businesses in there too, so people don't have to drive everywhere to get around, and thus decreasing our dependency on cars. We need to advocate for more public transit. Suburbs do exist in countries like Japan and England, but because they're connected by rail or by bus, the effects aren't as dire. A side effect of having better zoning laws means that different people will get to spend time together. And through this exposure, many will see people of color and people of differences as nothing more than just their neighbors. These are just a fraction of the solutions we need to tackle the suburban problem. But it's a conversation worth having. Because although suburbs do have some positives, their negatives have been plaguing America since their birth. We need to be able to tackle this issue, so we don't just live in these little boxes.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same.